other advertisers.
This is ContactTalkRadio.com. Consciousness in action. And you are taking action into your consciousness by tuning into Contact Talk Radio.
And on TuneIn.com, Hing.fm, and UpSnap Mobile.
Contact Talk Radio. Welcome to What the Health, an independent approach to your health span. Have you noticed how our healthcare system may not have your best interest in mind? Join Dr. Eckel in this fun and sometimes disturbing exploration of the state of healthcare and what it means for you. Now, here's your host, Dr. Eckel.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. I am Dr. Greg Eckel, and this is What the Health. And have you noticed that perhaps the system doesn't have your best interest at hand? We've got a doozy of a topic today. So hopefully you've made it past the title that I put out there, because we're going to talk about mitochondrial dysfunction and brain health, and in particular, if I can even pronounce it correctly, right? Stephanie set me up with this one, Deuterium, and its homeostasis and basically the functioning of it. First off, I do want to really welcome back to the show, Stephanie Seneff, and I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro and your bio, which is very impressive. So, senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory in Cambridge, Mass. She has a BS degree from MIT in biology and a PhD from MIT in electrical engineering and computer science. Recent interests have focused on the role of toxic chemicals and micronutrient deficiencies in health and disease, with a special emphasis on the pervasive herbicide glyphosate and the mineral sulfur. Since 2008, she has authored over 36 peer-reviewed journal papers on these topics. She's writing a book on glyphosate titled Toxic Legacy: How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment. That is going to be coming out on Chelsea Green Publishers in June of 2021. Stephanie, welcome aboard.
So great to be here. Thank you for having me.
You really have been out on the forefront with glyphosate, sulfur research, these micronutrients, and their health. I was just back in my kind of doctor's clubhouse, the lunchroom in my clinic, talking about kind of getting wound up for our discussion today, because it's always super fascinating. And, I have said, basically, Professor Seralani is one of my all-time heroes. He's just a hero of mine. I had the pleasure of hearing his first North American talk in California a couple years back. And, the way that he got attacked for speaking out against this, because it is billions of dollars. And, it has become evident that Monsanto has created crimes against humanity with regards to this product that they keep. It's so ubiquitous and found in children's, cereals, etc. And now we have more and more layers, just keeps unfolding. And so one of the ways that I wanted to kind of get in on this topic is, we have a word I can't even pronounce in the scientific literature. And a lot of the lay publics, they might be like, oh, I don't know that I can get into that one. How do you kind of lob this up for our viewers and listeners on what we're talking about today?
It's hard to know where to start. I should really give a bit of my history, because it's just been amazing for me, the research that I've done over the past 12 years. And just discovering, different phases where a new insight arises, and then it fits into the whole framework of the thing I'm building. And there's like this monster thing in my mind that represents human metabolism and everything, all the things that are going on in the cells and how the toxic chemicals are disrupting them. And it's just a really fascinating thing. Glyphosate is actually a really good window on human metabolism, because it messes it up so badly. So it becomes a fun game to look at the correlations, which diseases are going up dramatically. Many are, which one is exactly in step with glyphosate, and then why. I always ask why, looking at the particular enzymes involved in those diseases and how glyphosate would affect them. And then getting a new topic thrown in periodically over the years. This past year has been very exciting with respect to deuterium, as you mentioned, and also COVID-19. Those two have really kept me busy. So I've been learning everything I can about deuterium over the past year. And of course, once COVID-19 hit, I started reading everything I could about that. And so the whole thing is pulling together into an amazing story that I believe is what's going on. And it really starts with glyphosate poisoning. I mean, that's where we started. And this is why I think that you see the countries that are hardest hit by COVID and the countries where the new variants are coming out that have all these mutations, they're consistently countries that use a lot of glyphosate and that are leaders in the biofuel industry. And I think that's connected, that the biofuels are built from crops that are sprayed with glyphosate right before harvest. So I think the glyphosate is getting into the air through something in the process of producing or burning those biofuels, is what I'm suspecting. In cities that have embraced biofuels and then have them being used in the buses and the trucks and whatnot, they're spewing out, I suspect, glyphosate that's failing to get to the combustion point. It gets heated up and evaporated before it reaches combustion and ends up in the air. This is what I think is happening. And then you see all these conditions that are risk factors for bad outcomes with COVID, things like diabetes, obesity, high blood sugar, high blood pressure, heart disease, all these things correlated with bad outcome. And those are all diseases that are going up exactly in step with glyphosate. And also that I believe glyphosate is a causal factor in the epidemic. So it's quite a story, COVID, glyphosate. And then I haven't yet talked about deuterium, but that's where it gets really, really interesting.
Interesting. One ask on that is anybody measuring glyphosate particulate matter in those metros, or, is that happening?
It is in an interesting way. I mean, there was a study that looked for glyphosate in rainwater in, I think it was Tennessee. And they found like 86, I think something like over 80% of the samples tested positive for glyphosate. And I think the rainwater could be picking it up from the air as it comes down. Anthony Samsel is a friend of mine who's been studying glyphosate for quite some time. He's a toxicologist, and he's been soliciting samples of rainwater from friends. And so I sent him a sample from my home in Winchester and a sample from my work in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Cambridge sample, the rainwater came out positive. The Winchester sample, thankfully, came out negative. So it showed the city had at least in those two samples. That's very anecdotal. Yeah. But I think it's no one has, as far as I know, no one has been looking for glyphosate in the air, and that might be a hard thing to detect, or glyphosate in the biofuels, which might be easier. But glyphosate actually can conceal itself by binding to things. And the particularly troublesome thing is that it gets inside proteins. There was a study from Monsanto, where researchers back in the 1980s, where it's an interesting study. They exposed bluegill sunfish to radio-labeled glyphosate so they could track the radio label. And they were looking to see if glyphosate was accumulating in the tissues. So they took tissue samples and they found radio label in the samples. So they said, okay, glyphosate's there in some capacity. Maybe it changed into something else, but it's there. They measured for glyphosate and they only got up to 20% recovery of the radio samples that could be accounted for as glyphosate. So 80% went missing. Then they got the brilliant idea of adding enzymes that break proteins down into individual amino acids. And after they applied those enzymes, they got the yield up to 80%. So in other words, there was a lot of glyphosate hiding in those tissue samples because it was hooked up with other amino acids in the protein chain.
Yeah,
and very significant because that means it's getting into proteins by mistake in place of glycine. And this is what I've been saying.
And that was, I was just going to reiterate, like you have been educating me around this and the globe of it is coming in at the glutamate level, right? It's our DNA is incorporating it into.
Yeah, it's actually taken up by glutamate amino acid transporters. So the body thinks it is an amino acid. So it fools the body. By acting as an amino acid, it has all kinds of toxicity opportunities because it's a glycine. It's a glycine molecule, but it has an extra stuff stuck onto its nitrogen atom. And that makes all the difference. It behaves very, very differently from glycine, but it matches glycine for the code, the DNA code. So when the protein is being assembled and the code says I need glycine, and there's a glyphosate sitting there, there's an opportunity to put the glyphosate in place of the glycine into the protein. When you do that, you've greatly changed the characteristics of the protein. Certain proteins are very, very sensitive to glycine changes at certain spots. And that's the game of looking up all the proteins and finding, cases where glycine mutations cause horrible diseases and things like that. You can trace down which proteins are most likely to be affected by glyphosate. And then you can sort of figure out if those proteins are also involved in these diseases that are going up. It's a giant puzzle and it works really well.
Wow. any linking to misfolding of proteins.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely. Yeah. In fact, there are many proteins that normally make what's called an alpha helix, and they go into the membrane. Amyloid beta is one of them, the one that causes Alzheimer's disease. Amyloid beta has a sequence, a GXXXG sequence, 3 glycines with equally spaced. X is another any wild card amino acid. And that sequence, if that gets modified, to substitute for the glycine something that's water soluble, then that protein turns into beta sheets and stays in the cytoplasm instead of going into the membrane. Very, very different behavior. And when enough of them accumulate, these misfolded amyloid beta proteins, enough of them accumulate in the brain, they form this amyloid beta plaque that's directly linked up to Alzheimer's. So I think Alzheimer's is going up exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate. That could be a primary mechanism by which that's happening.
Interesting. Back to the bluegill study that you led with, when they looked at the enzymes, so those enzymes, even though they had the radioactivity, they were kind of masked on
you couldn't
initial.
See the way you measure the glyphosate depends upon it being an independent molecule. That's the problem. And it's not independent if it's hooked up to the rest of the amino acids in the chain. Yeah. It's not independent to see it. So people could be doing tissue samples, say, oh no, there's no glyphosate in there. And they could be wrong because it could all be tied up in the proteins.
Yeah, just kind of enfolded or used up in the line there.
Yeah, exactly. And when you add the enzyme that breaks it apart, then you've got it all, the tinker toys are all separated into individual tinker toys. Now you can see them as independent units.
Is this, so off of the Seralani research that he was showing, the Roundup was about 99 times more higher cancer causing agent than just glyphosate by itself.
Well, not necessarily cancer causing, but acute reaction to exposure. Very toxic, acutely toxic, much more acutely toxic than glyphosate alone, which is amazing because they studied glyphosate in isolation when they got the approval. They never did anything in the formulations. And then they add these things to the formulation. Oh, this makes it work better. Let's put that in.
Right.
And no bother that
Quote,
might be toxic
inert.
too.
Yeah,
I know, inert substances that are added, and then you've got those as well. And they both increase the uptake of glyphosate, which is really important because if the glyphosate doesn't go into the cell, it can't do all that damage. So the surfactants support the uptake of glyphosate into the plants and into the tissues of the plants. And then they're also innately toxic in and of themselves because they mess up the membranes of the cells, and that causes all kinds of problems.
Gosh, there's so many incidences of environmental toxicity really creating the mess that we're in with our health here. And there has not been due diligence done before these things get released globally. The list is actually getting longer as we age.
I know. It's so incredible, the list of toxic chemicals that we're faced with.
I know. The good news, we are resilient beings, and we are now kind of fast on the trail of looking at this stuff. So that's one of the reasons why I created this podcast and this platform, is to help educate the community out there on this news that they're not getting anywhere else, right? I mean, we've got research, you're well published, you've got a book coming out, and you would think that this would be groundbreaking information.
Right.
However, there's just too many dollars on the other side. It's unfortunate that I'm looking forward to the time where we live in the abundant world our hearts know and desire that can happen here, because there's more than enough for everybody to go around. And this is one of the ways, just getting educated on what our exposures are. So kind of coming back around into this topic, right? So really wanted to have you on around neurodegeneration and the deuterium link here. And so, the components of what is deuterium? Why is it important? How is this impacting our health? What does glyphosate have to do with that?
I know, it's really quite a story. And I was very excited when I know what deuterium is, but I really didn't know anything about deuterium in biology until last December. And I just happened to be, someone reached out to me, Laszlo Boros, who's a professor at UCLA in pediatric oncology, a cool guy. And he's very much not mainstream, I should say. He's been pushing this idea, look, guys, deuterium. And, he's kind of reaching deaf ears too. I mean, it's so hard to get that message out when it's something so new and people aren't aware of it. Yeah. Deuterium is heavy hydrogen. Hydrogen is the smallest atom. It's on the upper left corner of the periodic table for you chemists. one proton, one electron, very tiny. And deuterium is also the same thing, one proton, one electron, but it also has a neutron. A neutron weighs as much as the proton. The proton is most of the weight of the molecule. So the deuterium is heavy hydrogen. It weighs twice as much. And because it only has one proton, an extra neutron makes a big difference in how it performs. So the hydrogen, 99% of the atoms in our body are hydrogen atoms. It is absolutely huge. It's 99% of the atoms. It's a tiny thing, so that the other atoms take up a lot more bulk, but it's amazing to think about that.
Yeah.
And deuterium is naturally found in nature everywhere. In seawater, it's about 155 parts per million. So for every million hydrogen atoms, there's 155 deuterium atoms. Sounds like a tiny amount, but it isn't tiny when you start to compare it to things like calcium and zinc, all these minerals that are so important for our bodies. And calcium is one of the highest, levels in the blood. It's one of the most prominent minerals in the blood, calcium. And deuterium has about 6 times as much deuterium in the blood as calcium. So it's very big in terms of, compared to minerals, it's a very big number. It makes a difference. In other words, deuterium has impact. And what Laszlo taught me was that the mitochondria are extremely obsessed with making sure they try to keep deuterium out of their water. So the mitochondria have mechanisms to favor hydrogen over deuterium in the reactions that take place there, especially when they make water. And they make water when, as you know, they turn, maybe, a lot of people know that the mitochondria have oxygen, and they have some kind of food source, right? That's the energy source, like glucose or something. And they use the oxygen to oxidize the food source, and they produce water. So they convert oxygen to water. They produce water and carbon dioxide out of nutrients. That's kind of a well-known property of metabolism for those who are into chemistry or something, or biology. So they make water when they make ATP, and ATP is the energy currency of the cell. So it's very, very important. The mitochondria are supplying energy to the cell, and they're doing so with an enzyme called ATPase, which actually pushes hydrogen atoms across a membrane to create the force. The hydrogen atoms are the force that are creating the energy that can make the ATP. And then the energy is stored in the ATP molecule. So you can get it back again by breaking that ATP molecule later on. And so when that enzyme that does that absolutely hates deuterium. When deuterium comes along, it's kind of like putting sugar in the gas tank. It messes up the enzyme. It doesn't work properly. It can't make the ATP. It spews out reactive oxygen species, which are very damaging to the mitochondria. So if it gets a lot of deuterium, it can't avoid deuterium altogether. But if it has a lot more deuterium, it gets broken a lot faster, and a lot more reactive oxygen species get released, and the mitochondria get sick. And we have all these diseases, and as you know, all these neurological diseases, pretty much all of them are associated with mitochondrial dysfunction.
Yeah.
And that may be where it starts.
Interesting. So for those listening, the mitochondria, if you remember back to 9th grade science class, those are the kidney bean shaped organelles in every cell that are the energy factories. So this is so important when we're talking about a level of a heavy hydrogen, the deuterium, coming in and being toxic to the mitochondria. So this has far, far reaching implications for our health. All right.
Okay. So
keep going. You've got me on the edge of my seat.
Right. So there's a lot of enzymes that actually are very skilled in their reaction. They can favor hydrogen over deuterium. So if there's a molecule that they're trying to metabolize, and the place where there's a hydrogen, they want to take it off and put it on something else. And if it's not hydrogen, if it's deuterium, they say, no, I'm not going to take that one. I'm going to take a different one. So they won't react with the version of the molecule, the input that contains deuterium. They won't take that. So what happens is they make deuterium depleted water. Basically, there's enzymes that can make deuterium depleted water. And there are also enzymes that can put a hydrogen atom onto a carrier molecule that can cart that around and eventually deliver it to the mitochondria. And then there are enzymes that can take that hydrogen and make deuterium depleted water. So they're all, or even pump deuterium depleted hydrogens into the mitochondrial intermembrane space to charge up, because you need to get a lot of protons in there. Those are the hydrogen atoms, they're positively charged protons. You need to pile them up inside the membrane of the mitochondria, and then they go zooming across back into what's called the matrix in the middle of the mitochondria. They go across that boundary into the matrix. That's how you make the ATP. So they want to charge up with hydrogen, not deuterium. And the enzymes that push the hydrogen in know how to no, I don't want deuterium. I just want hydrogen. So they make mistakes, but mostly they can favor hydrogen over deuterium. Many enzymes can do that.
So question on that, is there a preferred route? I mean, is it hydrogen dense water, like the hydrogen tablets that we're seeing, or more the deuterium depleted water? Or
good question.
Yeah.
Good question. Yeah. And so I think actually hydrogen, hydrogen is being hyped, right? You can buy those little tablets, you put them in, and you have hydrogen gas. That's hydrogen gas. I think the reason why hydrogen gas is healthy is because it's deuterium depleted. And in fact, there was a study on a bacterium that had enzymes that could make hydrogen gas out of, could make hydrogen gas. And the hydrogen gas that enzyme made had only 20 parts per million instead of 155 parts per million, way down in terms of the amount of deuterium in that hydrogen gas. Because hydrogen is lighter, so it's more easily goes into the gas. And it also doesn't stick as well to the molecules that it's attached to. Deuterium has a stronger bond. So hydrogen is much more likely to get released as a gas and also to get pulled away from wherever it's stuck to in the stuff. So hydrogen gas is a deuterium depleted hydrogen that you're getting when you get hydrogen gas. And of course, deuterium depleted water is just water with less deuterium. And you can get that down to 10 parts per million. I've been taking it actually, 10 parts per million deuterium depleted water.
Okay.
I believe it has health benefits, but it's sort of a workaround because your real problem is the glyphosate. Glyphosate is disrupting many of those enzymes that know how to select for hydrogen over deuterium.
So this was not really an issue before we had glyphosate in the environment.
Exactly. That's what I think.
Interesting. Because I've been wondering why, this term deuterium is coming up more and more frequently.
Right.
And so that's fascinating. So talk us through this little component then on how is that happening? How are you seeing the glyphosate connection with deuterium?
Yeah, and of course that's a complicated story. There's very specific enzymes with very specific sites, but the cool thing is the flavoproteins. There's a whole class of enzymes called flavoproteins, and they are enzymes that bind flavins. F-A-L-A-V-I-N-S, flavins. And you probably know about flavonoids and terpenoids. These are plant-based molecules that are helpful, very, very good for you.
Yes.
Those are sort of, they're like flavins. So the flavins are coming from riboflavin, the B vitamin. Mm-hmm. And the flavins, they're called FAD and FMN, these things that bind to these proteins. And these proteins that are flavoproteins bind to these molecules that are flavins. And they bind phosphate in those molecules. Those molecules have phosphate in them. And the enzyme binds to the phosphate, and it binds to the phosphate at a site that has a specific motif. A motif is sort of a pattern of amino acids that you expect to see at the place where something happens in an enzyme. It becomes a very critical piece of that enzyme that has to be preserved for the enzyme to work. And this motif for the flavin binding site is a GXG-XXG motif, meaning that it has 3 glycine residues and then 3 other amino acids, which could be glycine, but they could be anything. So there's 3 required glycines, and then the other ones are wild cards in that sequence at the place where it binds the phosphate. And this is basically universally true for these flavoproteins. And I had already identified them as being proteins that would be susceptible to glyphosate before I even knew about deuterium. I knew that. And then I come to find out they are really good at favoring hydrogen over deuterium. They have a very special design. It's really quite cool in terms of the physics of the situation, because they pull a hydrogen atom off of something called NADH or NADPH. They pull that H off, and then they pull it through to the flavin. The flavin grabs it, and then the flavin sends it along, and it's going through these tunnels along the way, and it sends it along to the product. So you're taking a hydrogen off of NADPH, and you're sticking it onto something that's the product. Could be water, but it's some other things too. That NADPH already has really good hydrogen, because the thing that made it typically is also, no, I don't want deuterium. So you end up with a good H on that guy. And then this enzyme pulls another H out of the water and puts 2 H's on the product. So you can make water, for example, out of oxygen this way, or make superoxide, H2O2, for example, by adding 2 hydrogens to oxygen. And so they do this through something called proton tunneling, where proton tunneling is this really crazy effect that can happen. They have these just a very thin line of water molecules buried inside the site where the reaction takes place. And the water molecules kind of pass the hydrogen along like a football. Only imagine that the water molecules are hanging on to two balls, and then they're handed a third ball from the left, and they throw off their ball on the right to the next guy. So when you do that, each one is dropping off a new hydrogen atom. It's picking up one and dropping off another one down that chain. And every time it does that, it would rather drop off hydrogen than deuterium, because deuterium sticks better, it's heavier, easier to get rid of hydrogen. So it's a natural way when you run it through a series of water molecules, you end up with almost guaranteed hydrogen on the other side. So this is just a really cool thing about these enzymes, how they work. And they need that flavin to be able to do that. They need to be sticking to that flavin. And they can't stick to it if glyphosate substitutes for one of those glycines. So they get messed up. They can't do their job anymore.
So they're not passing the hydrogen down the line anymore.
Right.
So what does that look like then metabolically or biochemically in the body?
Well, it's terrible. I mean, it really messes up the mitochondrial. The whole citric acid cycle gets pretty screwed up, because there's a succinate dehydrogenase is a critical enzyme in the mitochondria that is one of these special enzymes that can do this. And it is known to be suppressed by glyphosate. Studies have shown that it's suppressed by glyphosate. And when you suppress it, you really, the whole metabolism of the mitochondria gets messed up. You know, they can no longer metabolize sugar the way they should be able to do it. It's very, very severe.
So energy production throughout the whole system in every single tissue, our brains, our hearts, muscles, everything, pretty much all of our cells have mitochondria, is not functioning well.
Exactly. The mitochondria are getting messed up. And then of course they start spewing out this superoxide, all these, oxygen radicals that are going to cause damage. And they wreck themselves. They start, changing their DNA. I mean, there's all kinds of bad things can happen. It can lead to cancer. I mean, it's just a total mess. And of course, neurological disease could come from that too. So it's quite amazing.
In particular, so the flavin complexes in that chain so the bioflavonoids are the backbone to provide the substrate to create those enzymes for that chain reaction. Just an interesting aside, one of my main mentors in naturopathic medicine was Dr. Bill Mitchell. He's a co-founder of Bastyr, and he was so in love with bioflavonoids and the chemical structure. And he said, these things have been around forever. They are going to save the human race. And
he's right.
Yeah.
He's right. I agree with him.
Yeah. So it's kind of giving me chills sharing that story with you, but he has since checked off the planet, left his bodily form, but he really left that lasting imprint. I actually still have the notes from the class in my office with the chemical structure of bioflavonoids on the cover. So to hear like in this component, so when that system goes down, there's an increase of reactive oxidative species. So bioflavonoids actually are a way to counterbalance that.
Yes, they're very good because they can really kind of substitute for flavins. I think they can really help out with that whole process of selecting against deuterium.
Wow. And so deuterium has been around. My understanding of it is more concentrated in the waters closer to the equator and less concentrated at the poles.
Yes.
Why is that?
Yeah, that has something to do with the heat. The heat at the equator, as it's coming down, as rain is coming down, the water evaporates. And what evaporates is the hydrogen, right? Because that goes away more easily than the deuterium. So what's left behind has more deuterium by the time it gets to the ground. It's just evaporating as it comes through the hot air.
Got it.
And so glacier water actually has significantly less deuterium.
Got it.
And
it's just frozen, or?
Yeah, so that's of course it's cold where the snow came, right, in the glaciers. Yeah. I'm trying to think how that there's an explanation for that, and I don't know what it is, but the glacier the glacier water can have significantly less. It can be, I think, down to even 80 rather than 155. That's very substantial. And it's interesting that people in Iceland, for example, where glacier water is a good source of water for them, they have really good health. So I think it might be connected.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so we've got kind of the ATPase pumps and ATP and mitochondria. We're getting into biochemistry here, folks.
We are. Sorry about that.
No problem at all. Like this, our community, I think they can handle the truth, and they can, just stick with us, because this aspect often goes overlooked. Now, when you read about deuterium depleted water, some scientists are calling it a fad, and perhaps we don't have a lot of research on treating conditions with, this is in theory, right? With some really good research behind it. And very, very plausible explanation here on the direction of what we're looking at. And we know there are harmful effects to deuterium in the mitochondria. Like, that's a fact, right?
Yes.
And so the aspects of, I want to make sure we're providing the information and not making certain claims, etc. That said, we do know water is very important to us, and having very pure water is also key. We've talked about easy water and that layer around cells and
That's very
Pollock's
important.
work. And
that's part of it too. That's part of it.
So what, you have some actually interesting components here around, I want to go back to the beginning when you talked about kind of those circles around some of the hot spots for the deaths with COVID-19, and looking at the biofuels, right? Which we think, hey, we're being environmentally sound. We want to use biofuels,
right.
But those biofuels have concentrated glyphosate. So they're not necessarily organic crops. In fact, just quite the contrary,
right.
to create those fuels. So it's concentrating the glyphosate there. And that aspect around, I think I was talking with Dr. Greg Nye on the show around that.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah.
Around the components of Italy and New York and LA, with some of those bigger death rates that we saw with the virus. And so there's a component here around lungs and respiratory tract that I want to make sure that we bring up and touch upon today.
Right. And in fact, it's interesting to me that in the fall, during the harvest season, there were huge upticks of COVID-19 in the farm country. All the states that have a lot of farm country had huge outbreaks. They were pretty good up until that time. And then once it got into the harvest season, they really, COVID took off. And I'm imagining they were spraying glyphosate on the crops and they were breathing it. I think it can be that immediate, the effect, because I think glyphosate is basically messing up the immune system in the lungs, the innate immune system. And in fact, in general, it's messing up the innate immune system. I have a whole chapter in my new book on that topic, and I show how it would mess it up if you believe it's substituting for glycine. There's some really critical, very powerful molecules that are produced by the immune cells, the innate immune system. This is not the adaptive, and this is important. This is like this innate immune system can clear COVID-19, I'm convinced, without ever drawing an antibody, not ever making a single antibody. And that's a healthy system that does that.
Yeah.
I worry about the vaccines because they intentionally bypass the innate immune system. They go past all the mucosal membranes straight into the muscle. And then they just immediately draw on the adaptive system to respond. Their whole goal is to make sure you make antibodies, and antibodies is how you get autoimmune disease. So I feel like a person who's healthy and has a strong immune system does not need a vaccine to protect themselves from COVID. They can perfectly well cope with it, without issues. I feel.
No, and the research actually backs you up on that, Stephanie. I mean, when you do not have the pre-existing conditions, unfortunately, nobody is talking about that. We've had 10, 11 months of propaganda to educate people about actually how their immune system works. And now more than ever, your health is important. But it's like there's some disconnect or discordance on, in fact, active censorship trying to do that, out there.
It's so crazy.
it really is.
Infuriates me that the news they're always talking about how to social distancing and face masks and all of that, and contact tracing, and not a word about just get out in the sun and get some vitamin D.
You're
so
innate, like we have an immune system. Again, another aside, back when there was the flu vaccine shortage, I dressed up as my favorite superhero, who I called Innate Immunity. It was a scripted red cape, and I handed out scrolls on your innate immune system and how it functions, because we've had HIV positive patients contract pneumonia and actually survive, which is unheard of in conventional medicine, is because we were supporting the innate immune system. And that's our cellular immunity. So everybody listening, if you've got questions on that, you can definitely, write them in. We'll maybe can have a whole what the health around your innate immunity, our favorite superhero these days. So I'm totally with you on that comment, in that bolstering the terrain in our bodies. And eliminating these toxins. So that's why this discussion is so important, because the level keeps rising between this and, I'm interviewing folks for my brain degeneration summit, which I did not cover in the first release of that thing, was around EMF and the electrosmog and pollution, and how, that's impacting our basically cups and filling it up with a bunch of garbage that doesn't allow our systems to function very well.
Right.
So
exactly.
That's a whole can of worms right over there. So let's come back over here. And we're going to keep talking on. So viral infections, you said, at least in the lungs, you say launch a complex cascade that can restore mitochondrial health in the immune cells. So how does that fit in here? So as we're talking about innate immunity and some of the impacts of glyphosate on deuterium, which is then damaging our mitochondria, when you're talking about viral illness, and, of course, COVID is still on, it will be here. Basically, they're predicting the third leading cause of death for many years to come, even with the vaccine campaign, because nobody is addressing these underlying causes of our ill health. Like, our population is sick. But okay. I'll get off of my soapbox and give it back over to yours.
Well, let me just say a little bit about the lungs immune system, because the lung has these surfactant proteins that are pushed into the surfactants, and those proteins are like tar paper. They can grab the viruses and stick them, and then make them very easy for the immune cells to clear. So if those are working well, it's a good defense against the virus. And if you come in, you can just trap them and eat them. The macrophages can just chew them up, and they're all done, and you're over it. I mean, you can just very quickly get rid of those viruses with these proteins. These proteins, unfortunately, have something called a collagen-like stalk that's critical for them to function properly. And that collagen-like stalk is like collagen, and collagen is a sequence, has long sequences of GXY, where every third amino acid is a glycine. And I think that glyphosate is messing up collagen by substituting for those glycines. There are lots of papers about mutations in those glycines causing all kinds of diseases related to the joints and because the collagen doesn't form a proper triple helix when it doesn't have those glycines. Those glycines are super important for the zipper that makes the triple helix. So again, they get their whole, the way they fold gets messed up and they don't work anymore. They can't clear the virus. That's just one type of protein that would be, and that's not just those ones, the surfactant proteins. There's other proteins that are like that as well. There's a whole class of these proteins that have these collagen-like stalks that the immune cells produce that can trap viruses. So those are all going to be broken by glyphosate. Virus is going to be less easily trapped. And then, of course, the virus gets taken up and multiplies, and you get lots of viruses in the lungs. And then you get this amazing cascade. The virus actually has that protein coat, that spike protein. That's the one that the vaccine it makes. The RNA in the vaccine makes that spike protein. That is the shell of it's a major component of the shell of the virus. And that spike protein has a shape. It has those little, crowns and stuff. You've seen many pictures of the virus. Yeah. It has little pockets that absolutely perfectly fit at a very common lipid that is in the membranes of cells. Which is a precursor to arachidonic acid. It's losing the name now, which is embarrassing because I know it very well, but
it will come to you.
Yeah. That's funny. Okay, a little bit of a senior moment there, but anyway,
it'll come to you. Yeah,
it's a very common linoleic. I got it. Linoleic acid, very common fatty acid in the membranes of the cells, and also in our food. Linoleic acid is a very common fatty acid in our foods. Linoleic acid fits into these pockets in the shell. So as the virus exits the cell, it picks up linoleic acid from the shell membrane and puts it into those pockets. And then that linoleic acid, it triggers a reaction cascade that involves the production of something called lipoxygenase. Lipoxygenase is an enzyme that converts that linoleic acid into a class of molecules called leukotrienes. So this is all quite complicated, but the leukotrienes then launch this incredible cascade that takes off with this, it's something called bradykinin gets produced, and then bradykinin causes other things to happen. And basically the immune cells, the membranes of the vasculature becomes leaky, like the capillaries allow the macrophages to get out and to go into the tissues in the lungs. And then not only the macrophages, but the platelets, the macrophages, and some stem cells coming in from the bones. I mean, all these different cells having a big party there in the lungs. There's all these immune cells coming in to the lungs to try to control this virus. And this reaction with the leukotrienes and the lipoxygenase is amazing, because lipoxygenase is the best protein enzyme I have found anywhere that in terms of selecting hydrogen over deuterium. Very, very interesting. Extremely good at selecting hydrogen over deuterium. Really, really good at it. Much better than anything else. And it's not a flavoprotein. It doesn't bind heme. Those are the things that are critical where glyphosate's messing it up. It doesn't do either one of those things. So it seems to me like it's a robust solution to make deuterium depleted. It makes water.
Yeah.
And when it makes those leukotrienes, it makes water. So what happens is water builds up in the lungs because this enzyme is busy making water, that you're pulling it out of the fatty acids to make water with oxygen. So you fill up the lungs with water, and people feel like they're drowning. They get all this. And it also causes, this bradykinin causes a huge overproduction of something called hyaluronic acid. And hyaluronic acid is this long, complicated chain of stuff that makes gelled water. It turns the water into gel. So what happens is that the alveoli, which are supposed to have air in them, these little circles all over the lungs, they get filled up with gelled water. And then, of course, I can't breathe. I'm so out of breath, and I can't get enough oxygen. You get this whole panic attack that triggers a whole other cascade that's related to having low oxygen, right? And so the gel that's made with the hyaluronic acid traps deuterium. The viruses actually trap deuterium. They're designed to trap deuterium. What's left behind is fluid water that's deuterium depleted. And then to make sure you have this lipoxygenase that's adding more deuterium depleted water, you're making incredibly good water inside the lungs, the fluid water in the lungs, which is in the interstitial space between the capillaries and the alveoli. That fluid water is super good water. It's extremely deuterium depleted. I suspect, nobody's measured it, but I suspect based on what I see. And then the macrophages is so fascinating because they launched this thing called macropinocytosis. It's a wonderful word, which is basically a big drink, macro big, and then pino is drink, so big drink. So they sweep up this deuterium depleted water and whatever else is in it, and of course, including the viruses, but also including mitochondria that have been let go by the platelets. So the platelets come in there, and the platelets carry about 5 to 8, each platelet carries about 5 to 8 individual mitochondria. They're loaded up on mitochondria. And I think they're basically a reserve mitochondria transport system. So when the platelets come in there, they're releasing their mitochondria into that deuterium depleted water, which is fixing the mitochondria because they're picking it up.
You're right.
And then the macrophages are sweeping up those mitochondria along with that deuterium depleted water. And they're saying, wow, this is fantastic. I can fix myself and be able to clear these viruses, because they're going to get a whole rebirth on life. They're so sick because their mitochondria are so busted and they've got such high deuterium. They can't work. They can't produce ATP. They need energy to fight the virus. They can't fight the virus. They're going to get fixed by that water that they're drinking that's being created by that cascade. And then they clear the viruses. So the whole game is to sort of, you're in a race against time. Can we let this person survive with a little oxygen long enough for us to fix our mitochondria, get rid of these viruses, and now we'll be done. We're great,
Right,
so,
right.
Against time. And if you're too poisoned, it just can't work, It's
not fast enough, right? That symphony is just, you really elucidated that very well. Now, the cascade with the bradykinin, that's the inflammatory cascade that you're going through.
It is exactly that.
So that aspect, that's just the repair of the body coming in there. What is just one layer on that, on just kind of immune system health for everybody listening is, they're showing really it is our immune system's response to the virus that is that's the thing that kills us if it's dysfunctioning. And they've shown with previous viruses that vitamin A and glutathione deficiency are high risk factors for this system that Stephanie just so eloquently discussed is not going to function well. So that has been in my recommendations from the beginning, because of the previous research that we saw with virology and different viruses in the past. It made sense. And we're showing in the research going forward that these are very important this time around too.
Yeah, and there's a new paper, and I just read it just a couple of days ago. Amazing paper. It's theoretical. It showed that vitamin A, vitamin K2, and vitamin D, all three of them, can fit into those pockets that I just told you about, where the linoleic acid fits.
Yes,
they fit in those pockets in the virus, and they interfere with the virus's ability to get into the cells.
Interesting.
Which is truly amazing. And those are people have zeroed in on those three. All three of those have been shown to be, when they're deficient, you're going to have a hard time with COVID. And we are deficient because, first of all, because of our horrible diet.
Yeah.
K2 is a big one. And I'm really fascinated by K2 because it really looks to me like abundant K2 is a very protective approach to COVID. So abundant vitamin D, abundant K2, that's the menaquinone. And K2 is found in, cheese and eggs, grass-fed beef, especially like liver, or it's like goose liver has a fantastic amount of K2, and fermented foods like sauerkraut and cheese, as I said. So eggs, organic eggs. So it has to be grass-fed beef. If it's not grass-fed, it won't have the K2. So it's really, really interesting that if you eat that kind of a healthy diet with healthy fats, and of course the fats contain vitamin A as well. So, it was such an easy solution to me. It's just change your diet, go totally certified organic, eat these animal fats, especially butter and butter is a great source, and
organic butter, right?
Organic butter, absolutely.
Yep. Yes.
So and then get out in the sunshine. I mean, it just seems like they should be screaming that on the rooftops to get us to control this COVID-19, and they're not saying anything about that, which just really infuriates me.
It's curious, right? It's very curious. That's what I keep just saying. Yes, I can definitely get upset about it as well. And it's just interesting that, no, there's actually loads of research coming out on this. This isn't made up things on the internet. This is actually real research. And some of it is actually longstanding. And then, the discussion was, you can't say that about COVID because this is a new novel virus. It's like, okay, well, now a year later, there's more research coming out. I want to talk about that linoleic acid. It's linoleic acid.
Linoleic, yeah.
And that I have heard Dr. McCullough, I actually got to have lunch with him in December, and that's his new book is on a low linoleic acid diet, because he is really tying that in to a lot of different health issues here.
He is, yes.
And so that it's not a good thing that it's in the pockets of the virus. You're saying it would be better if we had this vitamin A and K2 and D.
It's going to launch that reaction that's going to cause all that trouble in the lungs.
Goodness.
Yeah, and if you had enough vitamin A, D, and they would compete for the pockets, and so the linoleic acid wouldn't be able to get in, I would think, It makes sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't know enough, but that just makes sense to me, that if you have enough of those, then you won't end up with this cascade. They're sort of an indicator. Hey, look, guys, we're okay. We got all these things here. We can do it. We don't need to do this crazy thing.
Yeah.
And you don't want to do it unless you have to.
Right.
And you have to if that's your situation. And also the linoleic acid, I think the enzymes that change linoleic acid into better things get blocked by glyphosate. So it piles up because it can't get converted into these other things that would be actually very healthy.
So, wow. Okay. So what do we do know you laid out dietarily really nicely, and organics are important. Is there a way to unravel the effects of glyphosate in the system once it's already been in there?
That is an excellent question, and I certainly hope there is.
Yeah.
There are people who are promoting some products that are being well received. I know this Ion Biome, which is Ion Biome. Yeah, that's
yes. Dr. Zach Bush.
Zach Bush, yeah. He's really great, and I think there is something to that. I've only heard good reports about it. I think it's very safe.
We use that clinically with our patients with really good results as well.
Yeah, it just seems like, and that's like, I think that's got fulvic acid. It's got this, soil-based, very healthy soil, then fulvic acid, humic acid. Those are interesting molecules because apparently they're able to bind to the glyphosate and pull it out through the feces, or even they could be harboring enzymes there are these enzymes that stick out in those, that hang out in those fulvic acids, and that are very versatile at being able to break down various kinds of toxic chemicals. So they could be breaking it down as well, which would be really awesome. What I'd love to see, what I would think is if you had your gut microbiome, if you had growing in your gut specific harmless, we hope, bacteria that are able to metabolize glyphosate, that would be really, really awesome. And so I think, and that may be with probiotics, but most microbes don't know how to break that CP bond. Glyphosate intentionally has this bond that's it's designed to have this carbon phosphorus bond. That's an unusual bond, and it's very difficult to break down. Most microbes don't know what to do with that. So the glyphosate sticks around, and that's what makes it toxic to that CP bond. So, but there are some nasty pathogens that can break it down, like salmonella and Pseudomonas aeruginosa. These are things that are, real pests in the hospitals. They can break down glyphosate, which is interesting because I think they get a tremendous advantage over the other microbes if they can break it down.
I'm wondering, so glyphosate in the category of a pesticide is an organophosphate?
Yeah, it's a phosphonate, and that's quite confusing. It does have some of the same properties as the organophosphates. It's an organophosphonate.
Yeah.
It does appear to have that that issue with the I guess I'm not going to come up with it. The enzyme that is messed up by the acetylcholinesterase. Acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. It is an inhibitor, just like those organophosphates.
Got it. And so water soluble in nature?
Yes. And
so
and that's distinct from glycine. So that phosphate is that methylphosphonate unit is what makes it water soluble, which is also why it messes up the proteins, because these proteins are trying to use glycine to be fat soluble so they can go into the membrane. If you put glyphosate there, they become water soluble and they won't go into the membrane. That's going to really cause trouble.
Got it. And where I guess my line of reasoning was on definitely recommending sauna therapy for folks on sweating.
Oh, yeah, right. Absolutely. I think that's a great one. You could actually release the glyphosate in the water that you're in. And of course, it shows up in the urine, which is expected because it's water soluble. So that's where you can measure the levels in the urine, and that can be an indicator of your recent exposure. It'll show up in the urine within 2 weeks of exposure.
So yes, so
it leaves to the urine. So you only leave behind a bit of it, but what you leave behind is really nasty because it goes into the tissues and stays there for a long time.
Yeah. And as we're seeing here on the mitochondria and the deuterium, really does play havoc across the board. What are we missing in this conversation?
Well, probiotics, I think probiotics are really good. Sauerkraut, other things, things to eat. I already kind of mentioned that, I guess. And sulfur. I mean, I haven't said anything about sulfur, but sulfur is super important. The sulfate system is messed up by glyphosate. And sulfate is what makes the sulfated glycosaminoglycans, the GAGs that are the glycocalyx, which is that gelled water that surrounds all the cells or lines all the blood vessels. That gelled water is super, super important. And it's more important than I realized because it traps deuterium. So that keeps the fluid water deuterium depleted. When it's deficient, you're going to have more deuterium in the fluid water in the blood, which is going to then deliver more deuterium to the mitochondria. So very, very important to have lots of sulfates to keep that glycocalyx thick.
Got it. And we did talk about that on a previous podcast, but I'm going to touch on it here because it is such a big piece here. We are seeing a lot more people with sulfur metabolism issues, sulfate sensitivities, etc. Do you feel like that's a piece of the puzzle here with the glyphosate as well?
Absolutely. I think so. Glyphosate messes up the enzymes that convert an inorganic sulfur into organic sulfur, like taking sulfate and sulfide and turning them into methionine. And methionine, of course, becomes glutathione, right? That's the sulfur containing amino acid that goes into glutathione as cysteine. So methionine can convert to cysteine, and cysteine is one of the amino acids in glutathione. Glutathione becomes deficient because it's been shown in studies that glyphosate interferes with the synthesis of methionine in bacteria, and they synthesize methionine for the host. So there you can get a methionine deficiency at the same time as you've got sulfite toxicity because you can't turn those sulfates and sulfites into methionine because that enzyme's broken. And that enzyme is one of these enzymes that has these susceptibility factors that I mentioned with glyphosate. And there's another enzyme that converts sulfite to hydrogen sulfide gas, and that enzyme doesn't have those properties, so it's not sensitive to glyphosate. So what happens is the enzyme that makes the organic molecule methionine doesn't work, and then the sulfite is extremely toxic. You've got to get, and the microbes do everything they can to get rid of sulfite, so they can convert the sulfite to hydrogen sulfide gas, and then you get the bloating and the discomfort. And the hydrogen sulfide gas is extremely capable of, it moves around like a ghost, so it can go straight up to the brain from the gut, and then it can cause brain fog, because when there's hydrogen sulfide in the hydrogen sulfide basically puts you into a into a coma. I mean, it's basically like hibernating
into zombie-like status there.
Yeah, right. When you've got too much hydrogen sulfide in your brain. So there's both a gut problem and a brain problem associated with the hydrogen sulfide that's being produced by these bacteria that specialize in this other enzyme that doesn't need those factors that are being disrupted by glyphosate.
Wow. So it just takes off running. Got it. Well, Stephanie, it has been a total pleasure. Any final parting words for the viewers of What the Health here?
It's a great world, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's such a great world. I am struggling to figure out how we're going to have a future for our grandchildren, and this makes me very, very sad. So we have to change our ways, and I'm hoping that enough people will wake up, that we can finally be a strong enough constituency that we can stand up to these people and get them to change, take them down, or
Well, sitting here, I came to the same conclusion. It was like, we really need to get this product out of our environment, and it's ubiquitous in every store. It's a known cancer-causing agent. We see it in neurodegeneration now. We got it in mitochondria. Like, the laundry list is growing on the evidence. And what does it take? What's the campaign? We've got, there's a lot of different efforts going forward. Education is a big piece of it, and then getting active on it. So I really want to thank you. I am leaving hopeful, and I want our viewers and listeners to also, What the Health. This is it. Like, What the Health. That's why I dubbed it. It's why I have the Earth with some sunglasses on, because it is our mother Gaia planet. Our life support is really under the guns here. And a lot of the industry that we've got set up to this point is really detrimental to our health, the planet health. And so the new economy is coming. We vote with our dollars and with our minds and our hearts. So, if you like the show, please share it. Share it with 2 friends this week. Give me some reviews. Get those reviews up there, because that's how we make a difference. People really are searching, and I really want to see What the Health go up the charts this year on 2021 on the podcast chart, because we are bringing this type of information and discussion to you. So everybody, thanks again for tuning in. Contact Talk Radio on Tuesdays, 2 to 3 Pacific Standard Time. See you next week. Bye.